Okay, final round of the NDT. And Baylor gets a rematch with Michigan. And you may remember that when Danny and Marty debated Michigan in the prelims, we were affirmative. So now we're locked negative. And all year long, in every debate they've had, whoever has been negative has won. So we're feeling reasonably good, but there's one reason to be a little bit nervous. Danny and Marty had been in the finals of the NDT the previous year, and they had debated Dartmouth. And Dartmouth had just absolutely steamrolled them by running a new affirmative. And the new affirmative, I have to give you the short version of it because of one thing that happened at the current national debate tournament that I'm telling you the story about. Dartmouth had run an affirmative that other teams had run during the season, and we had put one of our not very good researchers on to work on. Dartmouth had stopped the sale of nuclear submarines to Canada. Canada had asked to buy an American nuclear submarine to patrol under the Arctic, but there had been a lot of concerns raised that this would undercut the non-proliferation regime. So Dartmouth runs this in the finals as their new affirmative, and they spend 8 minutes of a 10-minute 1AC just proliferation is bad and will cause nuclear war, and 6 or 7 reasons why. Arms races, crazy leaders, accidents. And then, after several minutes of doing that, the Dartmouth 1A, Sean Martin, then says, subpoint B, impact, and gets a big laugh. And then, just so Baylor doesn't respond with nuclear war good, Dartmouth has a couple of arguments about how superpower nuclear exchange would wipe out all life on the planet, it would cause nuclear winter, and so forth. And then with just a couple of minutes left, they read the plan. They're not going to allow the sale of American nuclear submarines to Canada. Well, we tried. We had given this as an assignment to a not very good researcher earlier in the year, and we had maybe 10 or 15 pieces of evidence that were irrelevant, that didn't say anything useful. We scrambled together what we could. They spent 9 minutes prep for the 1NC, still didn't get together anything they felt any confidence on, wound up losing on a 5-2 decision. So, on the one hand, going into the finals this time around, Danny and Marty were very confident because whoever had been negative had won every debate between Baylor and Michigan that year. But Michigan has out an accordion file that doesn't look familiar, and they haven't discussed what they're going to run. And so we're worried that it's going to be a new affirmative, and it's going to catch Danny and Marty just completely flat-footed. Well, as it turns out, Michigan did that just to mess with them. And as the Michigan 1A Andrew Schrank starts reading the speech, the Michigan 2A gets out all the typical accordion files with all the case extensions, and it's family planning, big overpopulation, the same debate they've had with Baylor a dozen times that year. So, Michigan in the semifinals had debated Emory, and Emory had run a topicality argument that they had been pretty deep on all year long, that foreign policy means goal. That if you're going to change, if you're going to make substantial change in United States foreign policy, you can't just change the mechanism, you have to change the goal. And they had decided that Michigan's answers weren't very good, so they went for it in the 2NC, and then went for it for the entire 2NR. And the decision was out for quite a while, and it was fairly dramatic, and one of the judges voted for Emory on it. So Danny decided to put the foreign policy goal topicality argument into his 1NC just to see if he could rattle Michigan a little bit because they might feel like they dodged a bullet over that. The other arguments that we were going to run were a politics disadvantage, that the plan was popular, and once again, this was going to be a debate about ASATs, and it turns out Michigan didn't make a single answer to the impact, so it was all about the link. And that we were also going to start the Russia debate. And then also, we had an argument that Danny had tried to write as an affirmative all the way back at the beginning of the season, but he never could get it to come together. And when they found out at the first tournament of the year that Michigan was running family planning, Danny remembered somewhere in the back of his head that he had one very, very good card that could take his affirmative and turn it into a disadvantage. This one card would be the link card. This card was from a guy by the name of Nick Eberstadt. And he said that a lot of developing countries that had dysfunctional economies and really needed to go through structural adjustment market reforms, they were putting it off because they were blaming their maldevelopment on overpopulation. And so when you gave family planning assistance, you relieve the pressure for them to give in and do their structural adjustment, to take part in structural adjustment austerity reform programs. And then Danny had very, very good evidence saying that those reforms effectively are inevitable, and the longer you postpone them, the more severe the transition is, the more starvation deaths, the more violence, the more rich-poor gap, and all the impacts that come out of that. Now, Danny and Marty had run this against Michigan a bunch of times all year, and had won every debate where they had gone for that argument. So they were going to start that debate in the finals of nationals again. And one of the things that Michigan just got worked up about is that Danny only had one link card. Just one card that said that developing countries would use that as an excuse and not do their market reforms. Except, before nationals, they had given me the assignments to go through all of the family planning negative and to see what I could do, what Danny might have missed. And I found 2 more link cards. So we were sitting in a different position with that argument. So, okay. So Danny gets up to give the 1NC, and he does what's traditional in the first speech in the final round of the national debate tournament. Maybe you do this at your national tournaments as well. Without the timer running, he takes a little bit of time and he thanks everybody who helped them get to where they are, thanks the people who ran the tournament, and then, when it's obvious he's about to start, they all start their timers, and the first thing that comes out of his mouth is, "Should run Canadian subs," and that gets a big laugh. So then he starts reading the foreign policy goals argument, and he gets to the reasons to prefer and says, you have to hold the affirmative to the standard of making a big systemic change, changing a goal. Otherwise, they can run little tiny affirmatives, like exempting one water project from the whatever amendment, and that gets a big laugh. So then he reads the disadvantaged shells, and then goes to town on the case, because from the beginning of the year, we have had really, really good takeouts and some turns to the claims all over the case, and then we've had very, very good solvency evidence. And the strategy almost all year long has been hollow out their solvency, do a little damage here and there on the different harms that they claim. And they were claiming maldevelopment, which leads to poverty, and then war and environmental destruction. And they had turned the environmental destruction into a global warming advantage about midway through the year. So it's a big affirmative, and it can outweigh fairly big disadvantage impacts if you don't whittle it down. And we have chiefly whittled it down by little bits of damage here and there on the harm claims, but then we go deep on solvency. So that's how the 1NC goes. The 2AC, Mike Thompson, then does something, not Mike Thompson, Joe Thompson. The 2AC, Joe Thompson, then does something really weird. He answers the topicality argument. He answers structural adjustment pretty much the way he always would. He answers the politics disadvantage in the predictable way, because we'd had a couple of these debates with Michigan before, and they said that the plan is unpopular because it's a perception that it's spreading abortion throughout the third world, and it's also unpopular because it's foreign aid, and that's seen as wasteful. Then he gets to Russia, and we're expecting to hear the same link debates that they have every time that they hear a Russia disadvantage. Instead, he has 3 or 4 unevidenced takeouts that he phrases as absolute takeouts, and then reads a whole bunch of impact turns. And that's really strange, because it's not what he usually does. And I can take you behind the scenes. We didn't find this out until later. Tell me if this is not the debater's nightmare. It's the final round of nationals. A team you're debating who's quite good on Russia. They've run their Russia disadvantage against you, no problem. You reach over to your accordion file to pull out your Russia frontline. You've given a 2AR on these arguments probably 3 dozen times throughout the course of the year, and you reach into that pocket, and it's not there. And you look in the pocket in front of it and the pocket behind it, and your Russia frontline is just missing. And it's the finals of nationals. You can't go do anything about it. So you lean over to your partner and you say, the Russia frontline is missing, put me together something quick. And what they did, his partner, Andrew Schrank, wrote out those takeouts and then put together the impact turns, thinking it would be irresistible to Marty as he was deciding what to do in the negative block, that he would see all those impact turns and realize this wasn't going to be just a battle over who could win the explanation of the link. If Marty wanted to win the Russia debate, he was going to have to go through all those impact turns. He was going to have to guess before the block even began how good Andrew was going to be in the 1AR, how well he was going to execute in the 2NR, and then what Joe was going to be like in the 2AR on impact turns, a big impact turn debate. And he was hoping, Michigan was hoping, that Marty would see those takeouts at the top all phrased as absolute takeouts and get tempted and kick out Russia. And that's actually what Marty did. And he said afterward that he knew if he was up against the wall that he could win that impact turn debate. He had the block. They had very good evidence in their Russia file, but there were just easier targets to go after. So he kicks out of Russia. So then Michigan is very surprised when Marty instead goes for the politics disadvantage and unloads a landslide, an absolute avalanche of link evidence, very quality link evidence about how popular family planning assistance would be, that it polls 80% favorable, that the people who are in favor of it are far more active and far more politically engaged than those who oppose it. Just card after card after card, because about halfway through the year, as Marty was trying to beef up the politics argument that he had, he keeps running across evidence he didn't expect, talking about how popular family planning is, and he has been sticking all of those in a file until before nationals. He realizes, he looks at Danny and he says, if we debate family planning at nationals, we're going for politics, and we're going to bury them in link evidence. So he gets to the end of that. He then takes most of the case because Danny is the expert on structural adjustment, because he was originally putting it together as an affirmative. So Danny gets to structural adjustment, and one of the things that Michigan has done is they have a fairly well-developed no-link argument that consists of picking on that one card, that one link card that they've been hearing all year long. And Schrank in the 1AR has all written out all the complaints he's going to have about the link card, and Thompson is ready with what he's going to say in the 2AR, that there's only one link card, here are the flaws in it, it really should have no credibility in your mind. Well, Danny answers the 2AC's link argument and then reads 2 more link cards, which leaves Michigan kind of high and dry. Because what are they going to do? You know, the judges will tell them afterward, well, you're picking and picking and picking at this link card. These other 2 link cards are pretty good. You know, at some point, they got 3 pieces of evidence from 3 different sources, all with impressive credentials, making the same claim. You have no evidence. You're complaining about the wording of the evidence. There's one other thing that happened, and I can't believe that I forgot this in talking about the 2AC, that we're all the way into the negative block, and I haven't mentioned this. Because Thompson got he had so many other things he had to do. He had to answer this topicality argument that had put a scare into him before. He had to spend more time on Russia than he ordinarily would. He had to be thorough with structural adjustment because they'd lost to it so many times. He had to do a pretty thorough job with politics because he knew Baylor was good on it and had been running politics on everybody. Then he gets to the case, and he gets all the way down to solvency, and he puts solvency at the end. I have no idea why he did that, and he runs out of time. He has to group the 9 or 10 solvency arguments from the 1NC, and he has to just refer to evidence read in the 1AC. And there are a couple of arguments he just doesn't answer at all. One of the things I found before nationals that I was so proud of was a very good solvency argument that was paired with a study indict. And what it did, the argument was substitution. It said that people who were taking part in these family planning programs in developing countries were previously paying for their own family planning, but they take part in the foreign aid program because, hey, what we were paying for before, we might as well get for free. And it had a study indict that went with it and said, these studies that talk about how effective family planning programs are in developing countries are based on distribution rates. They're not based on measuring fertility, and they're not carefully methodologically controlled to only focus on new users of family planning services. And this indict went on to say, they know that it's a flaw in their measurement of the program's success. They do it deliberately because it's what pays for their plane tickets to go to international conferences. It's a really good study indict card. So Thompson drops this argument in the 2AC. He also drops the momentum argument that even if you can get people started on family planning today, you can't make a difference until a generation from now, if you think about it. That's an evidenced argument. He drops it. So Marty in the 2NC tries to make these mistakes sound fatal, reads a lot more solvency evidence, goes through the war and environment part of the case, leaving Danny to deal with structural adjustment and the maldevelopment parts of the case. Well, Schrank in the 1AR does his best. Topicality is out of the debate, Russia's out of the debate, but he's still got to deal with politics and structural adjustment and a lot going on the case. And he once again puts solvency on the bottom, and I have no idea why. And he gets there with maybe 15 seconds left. And there are all these extended arguments, these arguments extended with evidence in the block, including at least 2 arguments that were dropped in the 2AC, and he drops them again. And when Marty gets up to give the 2NR, he's pretty much taking it for granted that Michigan's given the case away. They've twice critically undercovered all these solvency arguments. They have no hope of taking their case advantage and bringing it to bear. So he goes for both structural adjustment and the politics disadvantage, and then Thompson gives his 2AR, does his best to make sense out of things, and we have to sit there for a while. But I go up to the hotel room, because this is also before everybody had a cell phone, and I call home. Because all of the other Baylor debaters, they know that this is Elam Day, and they have all gathered at my roommate's and debate partner's apartment, and they're all waiting for the phone call to find out what happened. And I've been calling them throughout the day, updating them on who we're debating, what's going on, and they're having basically a little party, watching movies, and waiting for the call. And I call them and I say, the round is over, but the decision's not in. I think it's going to be a 5-0 for us. This was just devastatingly one-sided. I'm calling it 5-0 for Baylor, but I'll call you back when we have a decision. So the ballots are all in. The decision gets announced. It's actually a 4-1. One of the judges, the coach at the time at Wake Forest University, who's since passed on, a guy by the name of Ross Smith, he voted for Michigan. And he was known for doing something very healthy for a judge to do, making the best case possible for the team you didn't think won, and thinking about that and using that as a check. He would get a little carried away. About 3 years later, he was put on the final round panel again, and this time it was a 9-judge panel, and yes, it wound up being an 8-1 with Ross on the bottom. So we didn't feel too bad about not winning Ross's vote when the debate was that one-sided. But the last prank of the night, I came back upstairs and I called, and they answered the phone, and I said, well, they said, tell us. I said, well, I was wrong. And I heard through the phone, no, you're kidding. I said, I was wrong. It wasn't a 5-0 for us. It was a 4-1 for us. And I just heard, I'm going to kill you! As this, cheers went up on the other side of the phone. So Baylor at that point were the national champions. And the Sigurd Larman Trophy, which I swear I'm a hair short of 6 feet tall, and that thing comes up to my shoulders. I got to carry it home. And I got to carry it through all the airports. I wasn't the one who had won it, but I was part of the winning of it. It was a team effort. And it was kind of our little running gag that whenever anybody asked, what's that trophy for? It says in big letters on it, National Debate Tournament, but we would tell them it was a bowling trophy. And then we got to the last leg of the flight home. We were on a little crop duster flight from Dallas to Waco, and the weather wasn't real good, and we were kind of going up and down, and I was starting to feel kind of air sick, and I feel around in the pouch of the seat in front of me, and there's no air sickness bag, and I just look, because this is a trophy with a big cup on it, and I thought, no, they'd never forgive me.